Hey adventurers, welcome to Captain Talltail's Brisk Story Time. So what is Brisk Story Time? Well, brisk means quick or exciting. Yeah, so it's an exciting, quick story time. Yeah, you ready? Well, here we go. But I want to make sure that you're ready for exciting, brisk story time because I want you to be telling your own stories as well. This is what we're going to do. For the very first episode, I'm going to break down to you how to make a story, and then we're going to go over a real quick story. All right? But I'm going to need you to get your own piece of paper and a pencil or a pen or a marker, whatever you're good with. Hey, I like pencils with erasers. Why? Because I can erase my mistakes and fix them. You know what? I'm okay with mistakes though, and I'll probably show you some of my mistakes that I'll even leave. So here we go. Once you get a piece of paper and a pencil, go ahead and write a title. My title is Captain Talltail's Brisk Story Time. Yeah, check it out. Boop, boop. And then we're going to draw a straight line down the middle. Whoop. Oh, see, look at that. I already made a mistake, but you know what? I'm not going to erase this one because I like that. Here we go. And then we're going to draw another line about here and down here. So what we did was we made some different squares. I mean, those aren't exactly squares, but they'll do. They'll fit in there what we need. And actually what I'm going to do, I'm going to get rid of this piece of paper. See, even better because I already have set for you. Look at that. And you could even use Post-it notes to make your squares as well. So I made the Post-it notes so that you could see a little bit better. So on the first one, we're going to write start or beginning. Those are different words we could use, right? And then the next one, go ahead and write ending. Go ahead and underline them as well. Then we're going to write setting. The next one, we're going to write story. And on the bottom ones, we're going to write characters and extras. So we'll get to all those definitions in just a moment. The first thing that we're going to do is go with start. So what's a good way to start a story? Well, my favorite way is once upon a time. Yeah, so let's write that down. Now, what's another good way to start a story? Well, in book 2 of How Captain Talltail Became Tall, part 2, it's called Culture Island. Well, it starts with continued upon a time because it's part 2 to a book. So let's go ahead and write that one down as well. Take a moment and write down different ideas of how to start a story. It was a dark and stormy night. That's a popular one. And then once you've got those, let's move on to the ending. It's kind of good to start with the end in mind. Sometimes what I like to do is I like to write the last line of what I'm going to write. What's a good last line? And they all lived happily ever after. You could even write the end after that. And maybe you're not ready to write your ending just yet. So we can always come back to that, okay? So then let's go with setting. Now setting is a place, like a garden. So we'll be in a garden. Or maybe you want to be on an island. So let's write that down. And think about some places where you want your story to take place. So go ahead and write whatever that could be. In your house, at school, at the playground, hey, maybe at a theme park, or maybe in a plane, or on the clouds. Hey, whatever you want, right? Let's just go ahead and write down a couple ideas and go from there. And then in this box over here, we're going to write story. So what's your story about? You might not even know your story yet, but let's just go ahead and maybe take some ideas of what can a story be about? Well, if we are in a garden, maybe we're planting something. Now, maybe you can think about what kind of things you want to tell in this story. Do you want to tell somebody how to garden? Do you want to talk about a worm? Do you want to talk about a butterfly? Those are some ideas, right? So think about that. And you don't have to write this yet, your idea out, because we can always come back to whichever square you want to work on. Then we're going to write characters. All right, so what's a good character? Hey, you know what? I've got a tennis ball. I'm going to write that down as one of my characters. A tennis ball. And we had some other ideas, right? A worm, a butterfly. I hear a plane. I think maybe you could hear that too. Oh no, that's a helicopter actually. So let's write helicopter down, right? See, take in your settings, right? What's going on around you at this very moment? Maybe those are the things that you're going to write down. And here, actually, before we get to that, let's go to extra. Now, some of the things that I wrote here are lessons to learn, words I want to use in the story. So maybe I want to take a word like brisk and I want to add it to this story. So I'm going to write brisk down in this story. And then chapters, if you have chapters books, go ahead and write that down and write down what kind of chapters you want to write. This is going to be a brisk story, so we're not going to get that in depth into that yet. Then the series. If there's a series of books, like How Captain Talltail Became Tall, there's 4 books in the series. Wow. So you would want to write that down here. And then let's see. Ooh, items. If there's an item in the book, right? Now, the tennis ball could either be a character or it could be an item. So if you have a character like a worm, and then you have a tennis ball, and yeah, this is the item that happens in the story. So let's go ahead and write those kind of ideas down. Now, maybe you left something blank. Well, this is a good time to go into your mind, into your imagination, and think about which one you want to work on, which box you want to work on, right? So let's take characters. Now, there's a tennis ball and a worm. And I can always go back and change this up later, right? Like right now, where we cross out the tennis ball because the tennis ball is an item in the story, right? Instead of a character. But the tennis ball could still be a character. I don't know yet, right? We want to figure that out and think about that. Take some time and put your story together. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to circle the ones that I want to use in this story. So I'm going to circle once upon a time. And then at the end, I want, and they all lived happily ever after. The end, right? And then the setting that I want is going to be a garden. All right. And then the story is going to be about, oh, well, let's take the characters, right? So I'm going to go with tennis ball and a worm. And ooh, let's make a butterfly part of the story as well. I like that. Not sure where I would fit a helicopter in just yet, but you know what? Let's write the helicopter in for fun. Then I want to go to the extras. So what lesson wants to be learned in this story? Well, I think that maybe the tennis ball is in the way of the worm. So the worm has to figure out how to get around the tennis ball. And so maybe the butterfly helps the worm figure out how to get around the tennis ball. So that's my idea, right? And so I'm going to write that as the story. And somehow there's a helicopter involved. And so now we've got all these pieces circled. Now it's time for me to make a story. So what I usually like to do is I usually like to write the story out. Or sometimes I like to say, you know what? Forget the pencil, forget the paper, just hit record on a video so I can tell the story and make it up as I go along. And that's what we're about to do. All right, are you ready? Well, actually, before we start, I just want to say, before we get into the story, go ahead and write out yourself some ideas and afterwards make your own story. And you can even give me some ideas as a starting to a story, an ending to a story, a setting to a story to a story, characters to a story, and all those extra pieces, whatever you want. What kind of cool words do you want me to use in a story? Because you know what? I'm going to take pieces of what everybody sends me, and I'm going to make some stories. Yeah, and we're going to mix them all together and have fun, all right? So go ahead and send an email to me, info@captaintalltail.com, or you can find me on Facebook as Captain Talltail, message me there, or on Instagram. Oh my goodness, so many ways to message me. Or directly on the website. Yeah, captaintalltail.com under contact. And here's our story that we built today. Once upon a time, There was a worm that lived in a garden. And as this worm briskly squirmed, wiggling its way in the garden, until the worm came upon a tennis ball that was sitting in the worm's way. So the worm thought, well, I'd like to get by this tennis ball. So the worm tried wiggling to the right. But the worm was not able to wiggle around the right. So the worm thought, well, maybe I'll wiggle to the left. So the worm wiggled to the left. But the worm couldn't get by on the left. So the worm came back and thought, well, I can always burrow under this tennis ball. And so the worm tried burrowing. But the ground was too hard for the worm to dig into the dirt and go under. So the worm sat and thought and took a deep breath and exhaled and thought, I do not know how to get around this tennis ball. And then a beautiful butterfly came and landed on top of the tennis ball and looked down at the worm and said, hey, little worm, what is the matter? And the worm looked up at the butterfly and said, well, I can't get by this tennis ball, and I'd really like to get onto the other side. And the butterfly said, well, did you try wiggling to the right? And the worm said, yes, I tried wiggling to the right, but I could not get by. And so the butterfly said, well, did you try wiggling to the left? And the worm said, yes, I tried to wiggle to the left, and I could not get by. The butterfly said, well, did you try wiggling underneath and digging a hole and burrowing under the tennis ball? And the worm said, yes, I tried digging down, but the dirt is just too hard for me to burrow under this tennis ball. So the butterfly thought, well, why don't you just flap your wings and fly like me over the tennis ball? And the butterfly showed the worm how to fly like a butterfly. And the worm looked up and said, well, I have no beautiful wings like you, butterfly, so I'm not able to fly over. So the butterfly thought for a moment and said, well, I've seen other things fly without wings. Have you ever seen a helicopter fly? The worm looked up and said, well, yes, I have seen a helicopter fly before. The butterfly said, well, why don't you use your tail like a helicopter and fly over the tennis ball? And the worm said, I've never flown before, and I don't think my tail propels like a helicopter. The butterfly said, well, have you ever tried? The worm said, well, no, I have never tried. And I guess you're right. I should try. So the worm started wiggling its bottom until it got the motion of a helicopter propeller, until it started propelling very quickly. And then the worm flew up and over the tennis ball and the butterfly on top of the tennis ball. And the worm then slowly came down on to the other side of the tennis ball and looked up and said, thank you so much, butterfly. I never knew I was able to fly. And then the butterfly looked down at the worm and said, see, it's such a fantastic thing to try. And the butterfly flew off. And then the worm looked to the left and saw a wall. And then the worm looked to the right and saw a wall. And the worm looked behind it and saw a wall. And of course, directly in front of the worm was still the tennis ball. And then the worm looked down at the ground and thought, yes, the dirt over here is too hard for me to burrow down. And the worm looked up to the sky and said, at least I still have an option. And the worm flew happily ever after. The end. You see, adventures? It's that easy to make a great story that we came up with just today. Oh my goodness. So go ahead and make your own stories. Just use that simple formula that was shown today. Right, so hop to it. Well, I hope you enjoyed the story of the worm and the tennis ball. Until next time, adventure on.